1944. The world is holding its breath, caught in the throes of a cataclysm that has reshaped continents and consumed a generation. The greatest invasion in human history has just torn a bloody, continent-sized hole in Hitler's fortress Europe. From the beaches of Normandy, Allied armies are now pouring into France, a steel juggernaut of men and machines. To the east, the Soviet war machine, an entity of almost unimaginable scale and ferocity, is a relentless red tide. It has weathered the initial Nazi onslaught, bled for every inch of scorched earth at Stalingrad, and is now grinding the Wehrmacht into dust, reclaiming its territory and pushing inexorably towards Berlin. The Third Reich, the much-vaunted thousand-year empire, is bleeding out, surrounded, and fighting a desperate, unwinnable war on two fronts. The strategic equation is simple, brutal, and clear. It's over. Or is it? What if I told you that in the final desperate months of the war, as Allied bombers turned German cities into seas of fire and rubble, something else was rising from the ashes? Something new, something terrifying, something that threatened to rewrite the very rules of warfare. What if, from secret underground factories carved into mountains, from hidden launch sites in remote forests, and from heavily defended experimental airfields, Nazi Germany was preparing to unleash a technological storm upon the world? We're not talking about just another tank or a bigger gun. That was the old way of war. We are talking about a quantum leap, a violent lurch into the future. We're talking about invisible airplanes that move faster than sound, giant space rockets that can strike a city from the edge of space with absolutely no warning, arriving in utter silence before their cataclysmic explosion. We're talking about weapons so advanced, so audacious, they feel like they were ripped from the pages of a science fiction novel. These were the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons, Hitler's final insane gamble to turn the tide of World War II. For decades, they've been the subject of myths, legends, and wild conspiracy theories. But tonight, we separate the chilling fact from the fevered fiction. We will dig into the declassified files, the engineering blueprints, and the first-hand accounts of those who flew them and those who faced them. We will answer two simple questions. Did Hitler really have wonder weapons? And the most important question of all, could they have actually changed the outcome of the war? The answers will shock you. We are going deep into the archives for this one, so if you're into history that feels like science fiction, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. To understand the legend of the Wunderwaffe, we first have to understand the situation on the ground in 1943. Germany is losing. Badly. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a defeat, it was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. An entire army wiped from the map, shattering the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps has been crushed, and the Allies have used it as a springboard to invade Italy, forcing one of Germany's main allies to its knees. Above, the skies over the Reich itself now belong to the enemy. By day, the American 8th Air Force arrives in vast, continent-spanning formations of B-17s and B-24s. By night, the RAF's Bomber Command takes over, their Lancasters dropping blockbusters that erase entire city districts. The bombing is systematic, relentless, and designed to dismantle Germany's industry and incinerate its cities. German morale is plummeting. The public, once drunk on promises of swift victory and a new world order, is now facing the grim reality of total war at home. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's diminutive, devilishly clever master of propaganda, needs a miracle. He needs to sell hope to a public that is starting to realize the Führer's promises of a 1,000-year reign are hollow. And so the term Wunderwaffe is born. It's a marketing campaign, a brilliant and cynical promise whispered over the radio and plastered on posters. Secret, unbelievably powerful weapons are just around the corner, ready to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But here's the crazy part. Some of them were real, and the first of these to be unleashed upon the Allies were the Vergeltungswaffen, the vengeance weapons. Meet the V1. Officially called the Führer Me-163, this flying bomb was a marvel of cost-effective terror. The Allies had a few other, more descriptive names for it. The buzz bomb, the doodle bug. Why? Because of the unforgettable, terrifying sound, its engine made a harsh, rhythmic, sputtering roar that sounded like a malevolent airborne motorcycle. That sound wasn't a flaw. That was the sound of one of the simplest, cheapest, and most revolutionary engines ever built. The pulse jet. A simple tube with a set of shutters at the front, it worked through a rapid series of explosions that propelled the missile forward. The V1 was essentially a flying bomb with a very basic brain. A simple autopilot, powered by compressed air and gyroscopes, kept it pointed in the right direction, and a little propeller on its nose, like a pinwheel, measured the distance. When the propeller spun enough times, it meant the bomb was roughly over its target, usually London. An electrical signal would deploy spoilers, cut the fuel flow, and the V1 would fall out of the sky. For the people on the ground, that sudden, deafening silence was the most terrifying part. You'd hear that infernal buzzing for minutes as it got closer. You'd stand in the street, neck craned, and pray it would keep going, right over your head. But if the noise suddenly stopped, you had about 15 seconds to find cover before nearly a ton of high explosives turned your street, your home, your life into rubble. Between June 1944 and March 1945, over 9,500 of these things were fired at England. They were astonishingly cheap, costing less than a modern car, and they were designed for one purpose: psychological terror. To break the will of the British people. But was it a wonder weapon? Not really. It was clever, but it was also slow, flying at about 400 miles per hour at low altitude. Britain's best fighter planes, like the Spitfire and the incredible Hawker Tempest, could actually catch them. Pilots developed a daring and dangerous technique to fly alongside the V1, slide their wing under the bomb's wing, and just flip it over. This would tumble its primitive gyroscope, sending the doodlebug crashing harmlessly into the countryside. The British also deployed a massive coordinated network of anti-aircraft guns along the coast, guided by brand-new radar and equipped with proximity Fusestini radio transceivers in the shells that would detonate them if they passed near a target. This created a deadly wall of steel that became increasingly effective. By the end of the V1 campaign, over 50% of them were being shot down before they ever reached a target. The V1 was a menace. It was a terror. But it wasn't a war winner. It was too inaccurate to hit military targets, and the British people, who had already endured the Blitz, refused to be broken. But the V1 had a big brother. A much, much bigger brother. And this one was different. This was not just a new weapon. This was the dawn of a new age. This is the V2, the Vergeltungswaffe 2, and it was a quantum leap in technology. While the V1 was a simple air-breathing cruise missile, the V2 was something the world had never seen before, a ballistic missile. This wasn't an airplane. This was a true spaceship, 46 feet tall, weighing almost 13 tons, and powered by a revolutionary liquid propellant rocket engine burning a mixture of ethyl alcohol and liquid oxygen. Its creator? A brilliant, charismatic young engineer named Wernher von Braune, name you'll want to remember, as he would later go on to become the architect of the American space program and put a man on the moon. The V2 was launched straight up from a mobile launch pad. Its powerful engine would burn for just over a minute, generating over 56,000 pounds of thrust and pushing the rocket to a speed of over 3,500 miles per hour. That's Mach 5, 5 times the speed of sound. It would climb to the very edge of space, over 50 miles high, before cutting its engine and falling back to Earth in a silent, supersonic arc. And that's what made it so horrifyingly effective as a weapon of terror. There was no defense against the V2. You couldn't shoot it down. You couldn't intercept it. You couldn't even see it coming. The first sign of a V2 attack was the explosion. A massive city block leveling blast from its 1-ton warhead. Only after the explosion would you hear the sound of its arrival, a deafening double-sonic boom that ripped through the sky, as the sound finally caught up with the object that made it. It arrived faster than sound itself. Think about that. The very laws of physics were working against you. Starting in September 1944, the V2s began to fall on London, Paris, and the crucial Allied port of Antwerp. Over 3,000 were launched. They were pure, indiscriminate terror weapons, but they came with a horrific hidden cost that epitomized the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime. The V2s were built in a hellish underground factory called Mittelwerk, a vast complex of tunnels dug into the Harz Mountains. This subterranean nightmare was staffed by slave labor from the adjacent Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. Prisoners worked in unimaginable conditions, starved, beaten, and executed for the slightest infraction, toiling to build the world's most advanced weapon. Historians estimate that more people died building the V2 and rocket over 20,000 prisoners than were killed by it in Allied cities. It's a dark and twisted irony. The world's first spaceship, the precursor to the Saturn V that took humanity to the moon, was born from one of humanity's darkest moments. So, could this terrifying rocket have changed the war? The answer is a definitive no, and the reasons are simple. First, they were incredibly expensive and complex to build, diverting precious resources, skilled labor, rare materials, and ethyl alcohol, much of it distilled from potatoes, from things Germany desperately needed, like conventional fighter planes and tanks. Second, for all their technological brilliance, they were shockingly inaccurate. Hitting a specific military base or factory was impossible. They were lucky to even hit the right city. And most importantly, they were too little, too late. By the time the V2 was operational, the Allies were already closing in on Germany from all sides. Allied armies overran the launch sites in France and the Netherlands, cutting off the threat at its source. The V-weapons were a terrifying spectacle. They were a propaganda victory and a nightmare for civilians. they were also a glimpse into the future of warfare. But as tools to win World War II, they were a strategic failure, a desperate, last-ditch punch from a fighter who was already on the ropes and about to be knocked out. But Germany's engineers weren't just building rockets. They were also building a new generation of aircraft, machines that promised to sweep the Allied bombers from the skies once and for all. They were building the jet age. And that is where things get really interesting. In the skies over the crumbling Third Reich, a revolution was taking place. While the V-1 and V-2 were weapons of terror, designed to strike cities from afar, Germany's engineers were also creating a new breed of machine designed for one purpose: to reclaim the heavens from the Allied air forces. They were building the jet. Imagine you're the 20-year-old waist gunner in a B-17 Flying Fortress in early 1945. You're 8 miles high, it's 20 below zero, and you're flying deep into enemy territory. For hours, it's been nothing but the drone of your 4 engines and the nervous chatter of your crew. Then, your tail gunner's voice crackles over the intercom, his voice an octave higher than usual, laced with a mixture of awe and panic. Bandits! 6 o'clock! But they have no propellers. Before you can even process what that means, a ghost streaks past your formation. It moves faster than anything you have ever seen. A sleek, shark-like shape with pods of fire slung under its swept wings. It's moving at over 500 miles per hour, almost 150 miles an hour faster than your P-51 Mustang escorts. It closes the distance in the blink of an eye, and then your world erupts as a stream of cannon shells, the size of milk bottles, tears through the bomber next to you, which disintegrates in a ball of orange flame. This was the Messerschmitt Me-163, nicknamed the Schwalbe, or Swallow. It was the world's first operational jet fighter, and to the Allied bomber crews who faced it, it was a vision of the future they were not prepared for. Armed with 4 30mm cannons in its nose, a single 1-second burst from an Me-262 could fire more explosive power than the 850 caliber machine guns on a B-17. It didn't just shoot down bombers, it sawed them in half. A well-flown Me-262 was untouchable. Allied fighters were simply too slow to catch it in a straight fight. So, here it is. The Wunderwaffe that could have swept the skies clean, right? The weapon that could have stopped the Allied bombing campaign in its tracks and changed the war. Well, not so fast. The story of the Me-262 is a perfect example of a brilliant piece of technology crippled by fatal flaws and catastrophic decision-making. First, there was Hitler himself. When the jet was presented to him, he wasn't interested in a fighter. He was obsessed with revenge against the Normandy landings. He demanded that this revolutionary new interceptor be converted into a blitz bomber, a super-fast light bomber to attack the Allies in France. Germany's top air general, Adolf Galland, was horrified. He later wrote that it was as if someone had asked to use a thoroughbred racehorse to pull a milk cart. The modifications delayed production, wasted precious engineering resources, and put the plane into a role it was never designed for. Second, the technology was dangerously raw. The jet engines, the Junkers Umo 004, were revolutionary but incredibly unreliable. They had a service life of maybe 25 hours, if you were lucky. Sometimes they'd last only 10. They were prone to flaming out or catching fire if the pilot handled the throttle too aggressively. The materials needed for their turbine blades, like nickel and cobalt, were in desperately short supply in Germany, forcing them to use less durable alloys. Finally, the Me-163 was vulnerable. For all its speed in the air, it was a sitting duck during its long takeoff and landing runs. Allied fighter pilots, like the legendary Chuck Yeager, became experts at a new and deadly game. Loitering at high altitude near Me-162 airfields and pouncing on them when they were slow, low, and helpless with their landing gear down. By the time the Me-162 entered service in significant numbers, it was too late. There weren't enough of them, there wasn't enough fuel to fly them, and there weren't enough experienced pilots left to make a difference. It was a technological shark in a sea that was rapidly running out of water. But the Me-162 wasn't even the most extreme aircraft the Germans built. If the 262 was a shark, the Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet was a piranha on rocket fuel. This wasn't a jet. It was a rocket with a man sitting on top of it. The Komet was designed for one thing: pure, blistering speed and climb. It could shoot upwards at over 11,000 feet per minute, reaching the altitude of Allied bombers in under 3 minutes. For the bomber crews, it was like being attacked by a bullet. But for the German pilots, flying the Komet was a special kind of nightmare. Its rocket engine was powered by 2 hypergolic liquids, meaning they exploded on contact with each other. They were called T-Stoff and C-Stoff. If these 2 chemicals even touched each other outside the combustion chamber, they would explode violently. They were also incredibly corrosive. Spilling a single drop on the pilot's flight suit could mean it would literally dissolve his body. Pilots had to wear special acid-resistant gear just to sit in the cockpit. The plane took off on a dolly that it dropped after getting airborne, and it landed on a simple skid. This made landings incredibly dangerous, especially since the pilot was gliding back to base with highly explosive fuel remnants still in the tanks. More Me-163 pilots were killed in training accidents and explosions than were ever shot down by the Allies. With only about 7 minutes of powered flight, it was a spectacular, but ultimately suicidal, dead end. And then there was the machine that looked like it flew straight out of a Hollywood movie, the Horten Ho 229. Even today, it looks futuristic. A single, sweeping, flying wing, powered by 2 jet engines buried in its core. It was fast, it was heavily armed, and it was made primarily of wood. For years, the legend has been that the Ho 229 was Hitler's secret stealth bomber, a plane designed to be invisible to radar. And there is a grain of truth to that. Its smooth, blended shape, with no tail fins or large propeller discs, would have given it a smaller radar cross-section than conventional aircraft. A post-war study by Northrop Grumman, the builders of the modern B-2 stealth bomber, confirmed that its design was indeed stealthy. But this was likely a happy accident, a byproduct of the Horten brothers' quest for a fast, efficient design, not the primary goal. The reality? The Ho 229 never saw combat. Only a few prototypes were built, and only 1 test flight was made under jet power before the war ended. American forces captured the nearly completed V-3 prototype, which now sits in an American museum, a silent testament to an idea that was decades ahead of its time. So, could these futuristic jets have changed the war? The answer again is no. Germany's problem wasn't a lack of brilliant ideas. Its problem was a lack of time, resources, and realistic leadership. The Allies, on the other hand, won the air war not with a single wonder weapon, but with overwhelming industrial power and a philosophy of good enough. They had the P-51 Mustang. It wasn't a jet, but with its superb Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it had the range to fly from England to Berlin and back, protecting the bombers all the way. The Allies could build thousands of Mustangs for every handful of Me-163s the Germans could get into the sky. The German jets were a glimpse of the future, but they were fighting in the wrong war. They were a technological triumph, but a strategic irrelevance. But the Germans weren't just looking to the skies. They were also trying to create monsters on the land and in the sea. They were building super tanks, cannons of impossible size, and a new generation of submarines that threatened to cut Britain's lifeline for good. And deep in the laboratories, German scientists were racing to unlock the most terrifying power in the universe. They were trying to build an atomic bomb. That story is next. The Nazi obsession with overwhelming force and gigantism led to some of the most ludicrously oversized weapons ever conceived. On the ground, this manifested as the Panzer VIII Maus. This was not a tank. It was a mobile fortress. Weighing 188 tons, it was more than 3 times the weight of Germany's own formidable Tiger II. Sorry, it was a steel monster, so heavy that no bridge could support it, designed instead to slowly drive along the bottom of rivers using a giant snorkel. Only 2 prototypes were ever completed, and they proved to be what any sensible engineer could have predicted: a colossal waste of resources. They were slow, mechanically unreliable, and consumed fuel at an astronomical rate, at a time when Germany had almost none. It was a weapon so impractical, it was its own worst enemy. And if the Maus was impractical, its proposed big brother was pure fantasy. The Landkreuzer P-1000 Rata, or RAT, was a design for a 1,000-ton land battleship, armed with the same 11-inch naval cannons used on a warship. It would have been a target of such immense size and slow speed that it would have been instantly destroyed by any Allied bomber. The Rata never left the drawing board, a perfect symbol of a regime whose technological ambitions had become completely divorced from reality. While these steel behemoths were failing to crawl across the land, a far more serious threat was emerging from beneath the waves. By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively against Germany. Allied radar, air power, and code breaking had declawed the U-boat wolf packs. In response, German engineers created a truly revolutionary vessel, the Type WWII U-boat. This was the world's first true submarine. Previous subs were just submersible ships. They spent most of their time on the surface and could only stay underwater for short periods. The Type WWII was designed to live underwater. Its streamlined hull and gigantic battery capacity allowed it to move faster underwater than most Allied warships could on the surface. Armed with a snorkel that allowed it to run its diesel engines while submerged and equipped with advanced sonar, it was a silent, invisible killer. Had the Type WWII been introduced in 1943, it might very well have severed Britain's lifeline and starved the Allies out of the war. But in the recurring theme of the Wunderwaffe, it was too little, too late. Allied bombing of factories and transport links meant that of the hundreds ordered, only 2 entered active service before the war ended, and neither sank a single ship. But all these weapons, the jets, the rockets, the supertanks, the advanced submarines, they all pale in comparison to the final terrifying question: the ultimate what if of the Second World War. What about the atomic bomb? Germany was home to the scientists who had first split the atom. The German nuclear weapons program, known as the Uranverein or Uranium Club, began before the American Manhattan Project. So why didn't Hitler get the bomb? The reasons are complex and debated to this day. The program was disorganized and underfunded, never receiving the single-minded priority that the Manhattan Project did in the United States. Many of Germany's top scientists, particularly Jewish physicists, had fled the country to escape Nazi persecution, lending their genius to the Allied efforts instead. Then there was the question of the scientists who remained, like the brilliant Werner Heisenberg. There is a long-running historical debate about whether Heisenberg and his colleagues subtly sabotaged the project from within, either through moral objections or by deliberately overestimating the difficulty and amount of fissile material needed to create a bomb. We may never know for sure. What we do know is that a series of daring raids by Norwegian commandos and saboteurs on a heavy water production plant in Nazi-occupied Norway repeatedly destroyed a critical component for the type of nuclear reactor the Germans were trying to build. This single heroic act of sabotage may have set the German program back by months, if not years. The reality is that Germany was never close. Their scientists were still struggling with basic reactor theory, while the Americans at Los Alamos were preparing to test a functional weapon. In the end, the legend of the Wunderwaffe is just that, a legend. It was a propaganda dream, born of desperation in the dying days of a dark empire. While Germany produced incredible pieces of technology that offered a frightening glimpse into the future of warfare, they were crippled by a chronic lack of resources, strategic mismanagement, by a leadership obsessed with vengeance, and an ideology that valued gigantic terror-inducing projects over practical war-winning weapons. The wonder weapons were a fascinating, terrifying, and ultimately futile final chapter in the story of the Third Reich. Their true legacy was not in changing the outcome of World War II, but in providing the technological seeds for the next global conflict. The Cold War, where German rockets would launch the space race and German jet technology would define the next generation of aerial warfare for both East and West.